Hi, everyone. We're just going to get started in about a minute or so, just to have a few more people come on in, and then we'll get started. But my name is Dr. Dimple Patel, and I currently serve on the board of directors for AFSP Illinois, and am the co-chair of our DEI committee. And our two panelists today are Logan and Phil. And in a few seconds, we'll have them introduce themselves. So hang on in there. I do apologize if you hear my dogs in the background. I have some treats ready, but pets are welcome. All right, we'll get started in about a minute or so. And if you guys have any questions throughout for our panelists, please type them in the chat and we will address them throughout or at the end. All right, so we'll get started. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Dr. Dimple Patel, and I am the co-chair of our DEI committee and currently serve on the board of directors for AFSP Illinois. And I, along with myself, Meg and Beth, and Sean are also co-chairs of our DEI committee. And on top of that, we try to have conversations that are meaningful, but also conversations that are much needed as a part of our DEI panel discussions. And as our DEI committee, we are passionate towards increasing awareness, representation, fairness, and to create a safe space and a welcoming space to have these discussions. And sometimes these discussions can be uncomfortable, or we don't even know how to have them, but we need to. And this is a great place for us to start. And do not worry, no one else can be seen, just as panelists. So if you have a question, please ask it. It will be anonymous. And also in terms of addressing disparities across mental health and care, all three of us happen to be clinicians. So we are all going to be able to provide different perspectives on the disparities and challenges and barriers that we see, or even like the barriers to care and even stigma and shame associated with mental health that we're all going to be able to provide. And on behalf of AFSP Illinois, thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Logan. Please introduce yourself to our participants.
Sure. My name is Logan Cohen. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm also an approved supervisor with the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, and an additional certification as a trauma professional. I've got a counseling practice in Charlotte, and a couple other projects going on in entrepreneurship land, but I've been practicing for almost 20 years now.
Thank you. Phil?
Hello, everyone. My name is Phil Martinez, and I am a licensed clinical professional counselor here in Illinois. I'm also a board member with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention Illinois chapter. I've been serving in that role for the past couple of years. And I have a private practice in Lisle, primarily focusing on adolescents, young adults, teenagers, and the various obstacles that they face today. I have a very personal and professional connection with AFSP. I lost my cousin Mark to suicide back in 2004, and while researching some things to help support my family and his family, I came across AFSP and the first Chicago Out of the Darkness walk, and became so enthralled with the services that they offered that I've pretty much been volunteering ever since. And so they finally put me on the board. But I'm happy to be here. Thanks for asking me, Dimple, and look forward to our discussion. Your sound's off, Dimple.
I do apologize. My dogs are here, so I have to provide them with treats a little bit. So I do apologize for that. Thank you so much for sharing. And One of the things that I actually found Logan on TikTok and actually messaged him through Instagram and saw all the work that he does with men's mental health. And especially, Phil, you've talked about your own lived experiences with mental health and the struggles that you faced. I wanted to kind of dive right into both of your stories and kind of what got you started in the field of mental health, but if there's any personal experiences in terms of seeking therapy and any challenges or barriers that you may have faced along the way.
Sure. I'll jump into that. As I was kind of a rough kiddo. I was typically what you would see in like clinical settings when you have a teenager come in that is just kind of scoffing his parents and doesn't want to talk to you at all, and you have no idea what's going on with them. I had some substance abuse stuff going on. There was an abusive household that I was growing up in. There's a lot of stuff to be pissed off about and pretty stereotypical ways of dealing with it at that point, what I realized later. As is pretty common with rough and tumble young people, a good bit of several of my childhood friends didn't make it very far into adulthood, either dying from overdoses or suicides as well. In my early 20s, I graduated from the University of Georgia, and I had a really significant drinking problem. And at that point, I decided to dive into work as a wilderness counselor, working with at-risk youth. It was almost an excuse also to be in a highly structured environment for myself and be away from civilization for a while, and put sobriety together, started doing some of my own psychotherapy work, fell in love with counseling psychology and working with families and young people. Got really curious about where kids came from that were, started working with sibling groups, being like, where I need to get a little bit more of a systematic interaction into this. So then went into to study marriage and family therapy out west at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, before coming back down south. So personally, I've done some of my own counseling and psychotherapy, both as a teenager, where I'm sure the therapist I saw, probably thought I was never going to come back and talk to somebody again, really in their own head about how awful that was. And then as a young person, went on my own volition, went back to do some addiction specific work, and then later did more trauma informed work as an adult, when I started getting more interested in that work myself, and wanted to make sure that I could stay sufficiently regulated through those processes.
Thank you so much for sharing, Phil.
Thanks, Logan. I can pretty much say kind of ditto. Logan, you shared a lot of my story. Oh my gosh, I was kind of sitting here mouth agape at the parallels. I was the kid who should have been in my office at my age, when I was a kid. I should have been in here at 11 or 12 years old, because that's when I started running the streets in the city of Chicago, and hanging out outside of liquor stores waiting for somebody to get us a quarter beer at age 11, and then the fun just continued on from there. But yeah, abusive household, addictions in the family, mental health issues, just you name it, it was going on. And became very self-sufficient at a very young age, and fortunately fell into the crowd that made me fit in, that made me feel, or what I thought was feelings at the time. So I kind of wandered around lost for a long time, and alcohol was another resource for me that I fell into very early and very hard. Came to, by the time I was 16, thought that I had a problem, but was still able to make it through high school on the honor roll. So I was able to function. It's one of those functional alcoholics, I guess they call it. But despite the struggles, I continued to have a dream of getting out of that neighborhood, getting out of that environment, and initially ended up in the restaurant business of all things, but then decided to go back to school about midlife, about my mid-20s, I should say, not midlife, my mid-20s, and had just started dealing with the alcoholism and seeing an individual therapist, and decided to go back to school because I had met somebody that I fell very much in love with, and knew I didn't want to be in the restaurant business anymore. I wanted to get a real job. And so I thought I was going to be a CPA. So I registered as a business major, took 2 quarters of business courses and decided I had absolutely no aptitude in business. Remembered a psychology course from way back that I took back in Champaign, and had, just like I said, just previously started my own individual journey into psychotherapy, and thought to myself, well, maybe I could do that. So I switched majors, changed colleges, and took my first psych courses and aced them, and said, this is something. But very early on in my career, I started working with teenagers. Ever since I was working back in Gary, Indiana. I've been practicing 25 years now, and I'm still working with teenagers. Hard to handle teens, the kids, that are into the drugs, alcohol, depression. I struggle with my own issues with depression and anxiety to this day. And I'm happy to share that because, it is a struggle, but it's a journey, and it's a journey with its ups and downs. And if we didn't have it, if we didn't have those downs, we wouldn't have those ups. We wouldn't be able to experience them. And if we didn't have each other, there'd be a lot of nothing out there. So just thank you again for being here. And again, thanks for asking me to be a part of it.
Well, I want to say thank you to the both of you for sharing your experiences as well, for everybody that's tuning into normalizing those experiences. Even though we're all therapists, we've all have gone to therapy and are working on the struggles that we've gone through or still are, and to normalize that as well. And especially with some of my teenagers that I work with, even like the teenage boys and girls, I try to normalize that, hey, I'm a therapist, but I also have struggled with anxiety and I continue to do so. And here's how I approach it, and to feel connected in that way. But every therapist has a different approach, and so it kind of depends on all of those. And I wanted to kind of touch back on something that both of you had addressed, kind of that noticing it from childhood to adolescent to adulthood. Were there any barriers to seeking support and treatment? And also, do you notice that with the clients that you work with, either one of you work with as well? Or even just like the stigmas and barriers of like, I don't know if I want to go to therapy, how's it going to help? What's it going to do? How do you tackle that?
I mean, and I go back a little bit before Logan, but back in those days in the 70s, you didn't go to therapy. It was a stigma. Only crazy people, people who saw things or heard things. So that was one stigma. The other was, even though I was Hispanic, I wasn't a very traditional Hispanic background, but again, that was something you didn't go outside of the community. You kept it in the family. You kept it all inside. And you didn't let anybody outside know your business. So there were a lot of obstacles just to the idea, let alone the access. I mean, I couldn't even tell you of a child therapist or psychologist that I knew. The closest I think I would come was maybe a counselor in high school. But there was very limited access, and especially for a kid of color, going back that far, there was even less access. Definitely weren't going to be finding anybody that looked like me that I thought was going to help me. It was going to be, no offense, but it was going to be some older white guy in a white coat that I just felt completely disconnected from. So it really never even came as an issue for me because I never even got that chance to respond in that way or to use those kinds of resources. So, to see what is available today and to still see how limiting it is, especially for certain communities, is very frustrating. It's encouraging to see how much it's grown, but still frustrating to see that we have a long ways to go.
Yeah, for sure. And well, I'm glad that you mentioned the in your experiences some of the I call it a masculine shame. There's a very distinct layer of shame that men carry with them around aspects of identity that have to do with asking for help, expressing emotions other than anger, maybe a little bit of happy. If you express more than a little bit, you're going to get called a homophobic slur that's designed to bring down your social location. Or expressing affection, with other men, so it creates social isolation, and it gets them even more hyper focused on a romantic partner. There's a lot of social and cultural training that really prepares men for being highly avoidant of asking for help, and especially around a healthcare type issue. And a lot of that shame, over time is going to really present as anger and a propensity for control or fighting back, which is, you heard a story about how I remembered being with a therapist as an adolescent. That's kind of what they got from me at that time. I think the experiences that I had in the Jewish community growing up were definitely different in some ways than what you talked about, Phil. I definitely pass for white, especially if I am not coming out of the place of worship with the yarmulke and my payas and prayer shawl on, carry the white privilege. And so I've seen some folks that look like me, and there's some the stereotypical talk about the Jewish therapist thing, like that was a thing. At some point I was like, maybe I could imagine that. But then at the same time, in any kind of ethnic or cultural group, there is a highly protective nature about doing anything that could look different, or be seen as a weakness from the dominant discourse. And as we all know, like the stigma of mental health stuff is real in the dominant discourse as well. So people who run into more intersectionality along those lines are going to face that even more, mine being a bit less than what you described, Phil. I think there's also a systematic issue with men recognizing their adverse childhood experiences. When we're not covered in scars, like our grandpa who went to Korea, or how we remember our uncle talking about whatever, and the domestic disputes, and we're like, oh yeah, of course, like that you have. And we're kind of prepared for socially and culturally for being sort of like provider, protector, warrior, hunter stuff, that if there's no evidence scarring on the outside, it's very difficult for men to see that those early experiences could have compounded into issues that commonly present as being chronically stuck in a state of hypoarousal or hyperarousal, much less figuring out all the emotions that are underneath it. It can be really tough for men specifically.
What about generational patterns, kind of going based off of like what you had mentioned too, and Phil talking about the 70s, now being able to access some of those things? And how do you break that cycle, especially within BIPOC communities where there is that stigma of, especially in the South Asian culture, keep it in the family. You don't really talk about things outside of it. Even I lost my mother to suicide in 2011, and it's been 10 years. Initially after that, I was worried about my dad, and I tried to get him into therapy, and he's like, how's that going to help? What's that going to do? Like, not even, no matter what I was trying to do, I couldn't like get through to him. How do you guys approach that barrier and that issue, and with those that are hesitant?
And I think one of the things that, and really touching on what Logan was talking about, is that whole male defensiveness and the way we're acculturated, basically from birth, that idea that, showing emotions is a sign of weakness, and any sign of weakness, puts you on the downside, puts you at a disadvantage. And, growing up on the south side of Chicago, you either grew up tough or you got your ass kicked, and I didn't like getting my ass kicked. So that was my mentality, was how to get through life was to act tough or be tough, whether I felt it. Show emotions, heck no, that wasn't allowed. You show emotions, that gave the other person some advantage. But then you grow up into an adult male who thinks that emotions are not a thing that are accessible. Emotions are a thing that are a sign of weakness, and weakness or sensitivity is somehow a sign of being less masculine than another. It doesn't fit with what we think the stereotype of masculinity is, when we look at the sensitive child as being the one that that's not what we want. The rough and tumble kid. We don't want the kid who thinks about feelings. Heavens no. He might grow up to be a therapist or something. We want somebody who's going to be more stereo. It is like I said, as far as advanced as we come, we still find ourselves stereotyping kids based on sex. But I'm so happy with the way not just the LGBTQ community, but the transgender community and everyone else that has been able to come out and identify themselves for who they are and not have to live in that shadow anymore. I think that gives us incredible freedom to start speaking about some of these things in a public platform.
Phil, I wanted to actually touch on that. Recently, I just saw Phil a couple of days ago, and so actually, I think it was yesterday. It was 2 days ago. 2 days ago. And one of the things that we had talked about during our conversation was that ongoing supervision, or in terms of supervision or increasing a therapist's awareness into culturally sensitive practices, and knowing that, like even Logan had said, like I may not represent someone with a different cultural background, but I'm still here and I know the tools and how can we connect and provide some of those supports. Then one of the things that we talked about in our conversation was in terms of terminology and working with teens or young adults or anybody within the LGBTQ plus community, and how to approach that, and also normalizing it. And I had mentioned to you, like the approach that I had taken was, I'll address it directly that I may either, if I mess up or I don't get the terminology correct, please correct me and tell me what the correct way to go about it for you is in terms of pronouns, how you would like to be identified, and then also working towards educating myself as well. And even like last week in our supervision at Peak and Associates where I work, we had a fellow therapist go over terminology in terms of approaches, so that we're continuing to work on it with ourselves.
I think that's super important, especially being like the white dude in this situation, in this conversation, where like and I do a lot of trauma informed work, and I tend to be sought out as like the funky white guy in town in Charlotte. Like there aren't many of me to like that. Apparently, and I'm not that funky, but apparently I'm funky.
Clothing though.
So I think it's extraordinarily important really early on in meeting with folks who are BIPOC or women or LGBT identifying, very quickly say that, hey, when I miss something in my manness or my whiteness or my heteronormativity, you let me know. And just very quickly try to be humble and open to being led and educated in those areas and corrected. And not a matter of like, if I miss something, but like when I miss something, with the assumption that I must, because how could I, right. I'm going to miss some things. So, and those are incredibly important. And I think for making men comfortable, those are just as important. I think a lot of times an attending therapist who is seeing a male client, the mistakes that folks tend to make are around assuming traditional manhood expectations and abiding by them, rather than meeting a human being with their humanness, right? So what I just described, like, let me know when I'm missing these things, that immediately gives a man permission to start admitting when he might not know all the answers too, based on some of his entitlement in social locations and not having to be aware of some of these other marginalized narratives. And going against the socio-cultural grain as much as possible as a fellow. I'm probably going to be a little bit more playful with guys at the beginning. I'm going to ask a little bit more about their general interests at the beginning, in a way that men tend to be taught to talk shop with each other for a second before getting into stuff. You got to pace it. If you're a clinician listening, think motivational interviewing central when you're working with thinking about their stage of change and where you need to be meeting them with a pace, appropriate pace for them. And I think psychoeducational information play into that more analytical way that men tend to be programmed, like taught the software that we tend to be uploaded with is thinking in those ways. And knowledge is power to a certain degree as well. And then and once you have that buy-in, digging in on the vulnerability to show up, get a human being with you, and might be pleasantly surprised.
No, thank you so much for that perspective as well. And speaking of also, like you had mentioned, being a white therapist, and right now also, Phil, you can also touch on this too, in terms of right now there are very long wait lists for therapists, and sometimes you cannot find a BIPOC therapist. You might have to go to a white therapist or somebody else in the meantime. And do you find that there's a lot of hesitancy in terms of individuals who are seeking support or might be on the border of it when working with a non-BIPOC therapist?
I think there's definitely a sense of hesitancy. I like what you touched on, Logan, that idea of making that connection first before you do what I call diving into the deep end of the pool. And that letting them, allowing them to hopefully express that discomfort or recognizing it. Something, it's sometimes just the body language or the eye contact, that'll let me know what their comfort level is, and how much I want to explore that in the beginning, and make this as safe an environment as possible. But also knowing that I don't understand what their background is, even if they come from a similar cultural background as myself. Like I said, I grew up in a very non-traditional Hispanic family. So sometimes there's an assumption that I will connect at a deeper level, and it's like you said, Dipple, sometimes I'll say, you know what, you got to explain that one to me. We didn't do that when I was a kid. But it is that willingness to be there, to meet them where they're at, and that willingness, to explore and ask questions about what their experience is. And, like Logan said, and with male clients, it's very often, how about those Bears? That's a hell of a game on Sunday, wasn't it? But it opens the door. Sometimes it's going to be about theater. Sometimes it's going to be about art. Sometimes you get somebody to open up about their sensitive side, asking about movies or music. And you get to those things that aren't typically masculine, and it can serve as a really nice segue into getting to some of the more emotional pieces.
There was a question that I actually wanted to touch on from one of our participants that had asked, why is it tough for men to feel accepted?
The emotional neglect is normalized for boys. Being raised to be a tough little boy, to be an ideal good man when you grow up, is being independent, not asking for help, never expressing your insecurities, but sure as heck involves pain and fear. And those are the primary emotions involved in creating attachment. Generally, most men, when we think back, to 99% of the time when I'm doing an assessment of first meeting with a fella and looking at family of origin stuff, I got my genogram all mapped out and just making sure I have the pieces. Where'd you go when you got scared or hurt? And 99% of the time, the answer is, I didn't talk to anyone about that. And what that means is they learn that those parts of them were fundamentally unworthy of love and acceptance. It was all repressed and hid in the dorsal vagus nerve of freeze. And there is it's internalized at a very basic level.
Do you notice I know Phil works with a lot of teenagers, but even in your work too, Logan, more of an acceptance in the younger generation in terms of therapy and being vulnerable, or even saying, I go to therapy? Or do you still notice that there's still a little bit of a barrier, stigma, or hesitancy in terms of being vulnerable, or even acknowledging that they may need that support or go to therapy? How can other people, like parents, teachers, or those in the community, or even friends, bring up those issues or bring up that kind of a conversation?
I think it is really important, and we've used the term a couple of times, to normalize the activity of being in therapy. I actually know a high school teacher at one of the local high schools who did a video about his own personal mental health journey and how it opened so many doors for a lot of kids to see, oh, hey, Mr. So-and-so, he suffered through something like that. I feel like that. Maybe I should talk to somebody. And to let them know, like we were saying earlier, we're not just therapists, we're not just, mental health professionals, we're people too, with our own struggles, with our own things that we deal with and that we want to. And I really like what you were saying, Logan, that idea about, especially for men, you were taught from very early on that you get emotions, you hide them, you stuff them down under, you don't let anybody see them. And so how do you know if you're accepted if you don't allow others to accept you? And your whole upbringing is to be independent. It's to be, not counting on anyone, doing it yourself. And so, what do you mean reach out for help? What do you mean talk to somebody about my feelings? I'm not supposed to talk. I'm not supposed to have feelings. I mean, it goes that far. But so when you do as an adult male, and you really start to feel emasculated for having feelings, or for talking about them, or for being someone who is sensitive to that, and you still get those traditional, stereotypes that will come back at you here and there. But with teenagers, I am seeing a trend more towards acceptance of that. There's still, trust me, there's still that those initiation rites, boys being boys, and I'm not using that as any pat excuse, but I do see a trend towards more of them talking for themselves, and sometimes even going against parents' wishes. Like, he doesn't need to talk to anybody. He'll be fine. He'll grow out of it. It's just a phase they're going through. It's like, no, I really need to talk about this. And so they're recognizing themselves. And I think it often comes from seeing what their peers go through that allows them to say, hey, so-and-so did it. I can do that too.
I actually have an example to share of somebody, well, I personally don't know them, but I was told about this in terms of a teenager at a high school wanting to get support, but was afraid of their parents finding out. Nothing risk related, but just needed to process the death of a friend and just everything that came along after it, coping and managing school. And eventually, finally, like the student, I think, did go see the school therapist, but it was that worry about what if it gets to my parents, and that those cultural stigmas. And how can we as therapists, or even those in the community or friends or anybody, support those that want to get support, or even find therapy? How do we go about that?
So I guess I can answer a couple parts of it. I mean, maybe as a therapist, when working with folks who are BIPOC or in different cultures, in of multiple generations in a family, trying to frame some of the problems in the family, the places that they get stuck in homeostasis, more as a battle between culture, and a battle between social and cultural expectations or generational expectations, to depersonalize those tension points between the individuals, to help the potentiate a little bit more compassion for each other's positions, and not having to be as reactive and resentful about each other's behavior. But along the lines of kind of out in the community, I am seeing things change as well, as Phil stated. And even compared to in different regions of the United States, like living in the Deep South during the Obama administration, as it's still more traditional, and then went out west, like to Portland, and I was seeing what we're seeing, I think now, kind of more in the central United States and the East Coast, which is sometimes there's even waves in the other direction where like the traditional kids get bullied in some ways, and I think it's coming, and it's changing. We have to really just, I think, pay attention to it swinging too hard. Pay attention to making sure that we're not saying that like you should, avoiding always and nevers as much as possible for what people should be doing and shouldn't be doing based on, whatever our expectations are for them based on the culture that we're coming from, as well as just normalizing our own experiences and being open to speaking about them. The less people are talking about what their experiences are, the more everyone is assuming that everyone shares the dominant discourse in every space. So the more that we can come out with our own stories of our own humanness, that is stands to maybe lose a bit of social location if it's exposed, and just own it, the more normalized it can continue to be. Make it easier for the next person.
Yeah, and I really do. I couldn't agree more with that. Putting it out there as the normalization of it, and taking away, especially the gender stereotyping. I mean, I think the latest numbers are still like 4-to-1 women seeking help than men for depression. And it's because we keep sending those unconscious messages to our male children that it's not okay to seek help, it's not okay to show weakness, it's not okay to have feelings and emotions, and to be an example of that, to let them see this is, it's okay to cry, it's okay to have feelings, it's okay to feel bad, it's okay to feel scared. That's another one. You can't show fear, that's a bad thing, again, it's a weakness. But just to model those things for them, and to see that they have models of not just fictional characters, but of real life characters that they can look at and say, I can do that too.
We actually had a participant who touched on something that you just mentioned, Phil, of teaching their son and male siblings that it's okay to cry, and being able to display those emotions, making such a difference when they're having those feelings, and normalizing that. I even tell patients too, when even in the first intake, but also throughout sessions too, that it's coping. Crying, I consider that as a coping strategy. It's your body's way of telling you that there's something internally that you're feeling, but it's just coming out in a different form. Sometimes it could be anger and aggression, frustration, irritability, and sometimes it's in tears.
You bring up a great point, Dimple, because that's one of the main distinctions that we often see, or I've often seen in my practice, is that we mistake cognitive disorder, behavior disorders. We mistakenly will add those labels when really we're looking at depression. Absolutely. And that's the way a lot of males will express the depression, is through the outburst, through the overacting, the very physical acting out, where it's not that pulling the covers over the head or going and hiding in the closet. It's getting physical. It's fighting, it's arguing, it's being irritable, it's being dominant. Those are the ways, and all ways to bury those feelings.
It's absolutely. And I was looking up an example real quick that I've used with just even my teenage and even adult patients, of that iceberg example. Like, everything above the water is what you can see, and it's, in this situation, anger, right? But below the water are the things that we cannot see, and that anger is being that what we do see, but everything below is what you're feeling. So it could be the sadness, feeling disappointed, embarrassed, lonely, overwhelming feelings, anxiety, jealous, shame, scared, guilt, like all those things, but it's coming out as anger, aggression. And like both of you had touched on that, that's what people are looking at versus what's going on below the surface where the core of the issues are. And sometimes that gets mistaken.
Even in clinical settings.
Mm-hmm.
So when I hear like community members saying, how can I recognize these things? Like even trained therapists and counselors are misdiagnosing these things every day. How little girls tend to be diagnosed with internalizing disorders so much more frequently, and little boys tend to be diagnosed with externalizing disorders so much more frequently. And for the most part, that continues on into adulthood. And it just goes through different sifters and filters before it comes out. And it really is a systemic issue in men getting good enough care in these settings. And I think in a lot of different ways, you know, the feminist movement has been amazing. This last wave and the Me Too movement, creating so much more accountability and forcing folks to show up for very difficult discussions around the systematic oppression. And now there will be, you know, whole curriculums and semesters around feminism and these important topics in graduate counseling programs. There are none for cultural competency for men. And there are even a lot of spaces where you say that and you're going to get attacked sociopolitically. It's like not a cool thing to say. But the fact of the matter is, well, it was the systems that we have, these institutions that we have, were predominantly, you know, created in the context of patriarchy, that men have never known how to value their own humanness or value the humanness of other. And this is why we still have men completing suicide at 3.5 times the rate of women.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And I think the other part that I wanted to address on is something that you just mentioned, Logan, was courses in grad school for clinicians. I think when I had that conversation with you and Phil, that I had one class or another about diversity and that was many, many years ago, but where a lot of the diversity trainings and supervisions were implemented in my training sites every year during the practicums that I had. And then on top of that, if the sites acknowledged it, or it depends on where you are and how much effort is being put into the training process. And a lot of it, I think, fall back on us to do our own education and increasing awareness, especially with continuing education, but also with everything that is going on now, but also reframing and reflecting back, what am I not doing well, or what can I do better in sessions? And therefore, I always ask a lot of my patients too of feedback in sessions. Did I miss something? Am I not saying something correctly? Or even if I'm summarizing, asking for feedback in sessions. And I've had some patients have been surprised that I've asked them for feedback on how everything is going so far. What would you like to change? And some of them have asked, they've never been asked that, and they're surprised by that.
Yeah, I frequently will address that multiple times throughout sessions, even with people that I've seen over time. You know, if I ever say something that doesn't make sense, or if I'm ever, you know, way far off base where I'm walking down a path and it's like, Phil, I don't know where you're going with that. Please let me know, because there is the assumption, well, he's the professional, he must know what he's talking about. No, I need to take my cues from them and from what they're feeling. And it's that same way, you know, working with men or women, but in trying to get, you know, young men into that mindset that, you know, I have to act this way. If I deviate from that, that's a bad thing. It's like, no, that's not a bad thing. It's a different thing. Doesn't make it a bad thing. You know, it's these feelings I'm feeling emotional. I'm doing these things that I was brought up or acculturated not to feel or not to act or not to do. And so breaking those barriers as well, it can be helpful in those cases.
Absolutely. So we have about, I think, 15 minutes or so. We will definitely get to some questions. And if we do not get to your questions, we will email you with a response. So please don't worry. I also wanted to go over a few little bits of information, and also being able to touch on suicide rates, and especially within BIPOC communities, but overall in general in men, and how do you address it in sessions, but also kind of going back to just about the research, and that has shown in terms of BIPOC communities being less likely to have access to mental health services, or even to seeking it out, and also are more likely to receive lower poor quality of care. And there's also that the biggest barrier also is that part of ending or terminating, especially after a first session or after a few sessions. Have you guys noticed any of those barriers in terms of individuals that you guys have worked with, or the hesitancy to seek out those supports?
You want to jump on that first, Phil?
Yeah, I think frequently when you see that hesitancy, again, we go back to that, what we're taught, what we're learning, and what we see. And so, being able to open that door, it may be a crack, and it may be through the most obscure topic or setting that you could imagine. You might be talking about somebody's, first game of Little League, and that takes us, bam, we're in a memory, or we're in a place where it opens a crack, it opens a door, it lets them see that there's a safety in that. There's not a weakness in that there's a safety in that. And I continually say that in here, this is a safe environment for you, because so often, and since we're talking about a lot of male issues here, that becomes an issue, is that issue of safety. We're supposed to feel safe because we're male, but we're not. Or we're supposed to distance ourselves. Logan, you mentioned the attachment issues that become related to this, and it becomes very predominant when you see that we're pulled away. We're discouraged from running to our mother. We're encouraged to identify with the father, and get tough. Don't have those feelings. Don't go running to mommy to wipe your tears away. Dust it off and get back out there. So there's a mentality that we continue to fight today that's been around for generations, but we do see some progress.
And I think a lot of it, there's pros and cons to social media. There's a lot of negative things that are happening online and cyberbullying, but then there's a whole other aspect of especially like finding Logan on TikTok when I was just scrolling, and seeing somebody talk about men's mental health, or just mental health in general, that I would have never found, and thousands of other people would have never come across. And that opens that door for, even in the comfort of your own home, that you can kind of see these professionals talking about it, even being vulnerable. And we will share Logan's social media and his website and everything at the end, so you can contact him about the Balanced Man Plan, right, Logan? Is that what it is?
Yeah. It's, I think if you're a therapist or clinician, and I recognize as we're talking about, there's just systematic barriers to a lot of folks engaging in care, and that was something that I created, just spent my own time and energy creating from scratch this curriculum that is designed specifically for that. So if be the change, yo, you gotta build it. And these days the narratives are changing, but if we want to see it change faster, maybe we lay some bricks.
And kind of also addressing along the lines, sorry if I go in and out, please let me know. The internet is kind of being a little bit funky. In terms of addressing suicide ideations, or even active plans, or intent, or just even fleeting or passive thoughts, how do you approach it in session, especially if there's that fear, I'm going to get hospitalized if I bring this up? How do you navigate that?
A lot of normalizing.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's actually one of the things I talk about every first session I have, are suicidal, homicidal ideation, letting them know that sometimes you might feel like dying. You might not feel like getting out of bed. You might feel like if I stepped off the curb and a bus hit me, I'd be fine with that. And I'm not going to jump all over that and say, oh my gosh, you're suicidal, I need to get you right to a hospital and make some phone calls. No, I'm going to have a real long conversation with you about that. And if at the end of that conversation, I don't feel safe letting you leave my office, I'm going to let you know that. And I'm going to be very direct about it. I'm not going to, bounce around and say, I'll be back for a couple of coffee and come back with a couple of guys in white coats. I'm going to be very direct. And I can count, on one hand, in the 20 plus years I've been in private practice, how many people have gone from my office directly to a hospital for safety issues or safety concerns. But I cannot even begin to count how many people have talked about suicidal ideation in here. So creating that safe space where they can talk about something that's so frowned upon, that's so stigmatized, that we can think about it without actual, we could have that ideation without it being active about it. And the more we're able to talk about it, again, we've been using this word a lot, the more we're able to normalize it, the more we're able to say, you know what, I understand I have those feelings. That tells me where I'm at. That doesn't necessarily tell me that I want to die right now.
Phil, you brought up something really, sorry, Logan, you brought up something really important, keywords and how you phrase certain things. In my work too, with certain individuals, where there is a lot of shame and stigma surrounding mental health, but in particular the word suicide as well. And I would approach it similarly to you as well. Do you feel like that you just don't want to get up in the morning if something happened, that if you would be okay with it, but not active plans, but those fleeting thoughts that are there, and then kind of getting into like slowly more of like the risk assessment and assessing that way if I notice that there's that fear surrounding it.
I'll jump into that a lot more often than I used to when I first started practicing. I think I would hedge around it quite a bit more, because if I would ask somebody who is actively suicidal, are you thinking about hurting yourself? They might answer, no, I'm not thinking about hurting myself. But in the back of their mind, they're thinking, I'm thinking about killing myself. That's not hurting myself. That's taking care of everything. So you do have to be very specific about the verbiage that you use. And for me, it was a lot getting over that, speed bump of using the word suicide in session and not wanting to create a fear. Like, if we go down this path, there's a possibility you're going to get hospitalized. No, we're going to go down this path to see if this is, this is something that you're feeling and what we need, what we can talk more about it.
Yeah, I think I've worked for a few years on a suicide hotline when I was living in Portland and in grad school. And what we talked about as far as making sure that you're not avoiding it, just so essential. There's so much of taboo around this. And having enough training in assessing the level of danger with the person that you're talking to and what kind of symptoms they're discussing. And I think if you're working with men a lot, you probably need to have some extra training in suicide and danger assessment stuff. And a lot of times, a lot of times it's not, the danger is not extraordinarily high. They're talking about a feature of their depression that they don't know how else to discuss.
Yeah, both of you brought up great points too. And I think it's the biggest part was, even as newbie trainees or clinicians just starting off to that, getting over that fear or being comfortable with saying the word suicide. And a lot of it is that lack of, I don't even know if lack of wouldn't be the right word, but a lot of the training that I got was direct risk assessments was from one of my training sites, where I had to ask every single time, either directly or sometimes if I kind of notice a hesitancy, I'd go a different route, but still be able to assess and ask those direct questions. But that was because I had that training site for a year. And then when I did my internship and postdoc, where I had more exposure to risk assessments, that helped me so much more in my work that I do now, even with being on the board. And a lot of that depends on the training site. But I do think that even more grad schools need full classes on risk assessment or how to conduct these, or training sites need to do more of this.
Agree.
I think that's, yeah, that is a huge underserved resource that we have in grad schools. We didn't have anything that I remember in grad school, literally talking about suicide, let alone an entire class to talk about it, which I would, I would think that's got to be part of every program today. I learned more about talking about suicide in my internships than I did in the classroom. And that's, that's no critique against my education. That's just the way the training was set up. But it is a very important part to I think, get our professionals well trained and introduced into that, rather than throwing them into the deep end and saying, oh, here you go, here's suicide, what do I do now?
I actually have a really important question from a panelist that I wanted us to address, in terms of what suggestions do you guys have, or recommendations for educators in elementary schools on how to implement feeling and emotions into their curriculum, or even being able to talk about mental health and addressing, even if they're like with little kids or teenagers or even middle schoolers, of how to address and bring up any mental health related issue or even suicide.
I mean, first check with your institution to make sure you're not going to get yourself into a boatload of trouble from spending a lot of time in community mental health. Like, don't get yourself in trouble with your institution. Let's make sure you can keep your job. And then if you're not going to, try to put everybody together and figure out a systemic program or intervention for doing that, so that it can be echoed in several different places, and you have many different voices together doing that. If you're in your own silo, as an educator, the most, and you're not allowed, let's say, like, worst case scenario, the institution says no, you're gonna get us in trouble, it's not part of a programming or whatever. You just spending extra energy attuning to your students and giving yourself permission to contain space with them when they're getting upset about something, or making sure that you've done the work yourself to regulate your own nervous system, so that your first reaction isn't always like, go to the principal's office. Like, every time someone learning the other ways to regulate yourself, and other ways of using behavioral modification techniques that can affirm and support the autonomy and fidelity of your students, rather than thinking about how we can maintain more authoritarian control, I think is really important for kids.
Yeah, and it's interesting where you talk about the academic setting, and I can't believe I've gotten almost a whole hour without saying this word, yoga.
You're almost certified, right? You're almost certified.
Oh, yeah, I'm getting there. But it really is a way to introduce calmness and peace into a classroom environment. I hear more and more instructors using it. I've seen some recent literature on using it in academic settings at younger ages. And even a friend of mine I talked to last week said they've incorporated regular weekly yoga sessions into their travel baseball training schedule. Not just for flexibility and, core strength, but for the, controlling the emotions and being connected with emotions, being connected with silence. Another thing that many men are not. It's like, to sit and be quiet. What are you talking about? I'm like, I gotta get up, I gotta do stuff, I gotta make noise. No, this is connecting, and it's a very calm way of connecting, and it's very accessible to everyone.
We also, just to share with everybody on here, through AFSP, we have programs there for the little ones. It's Gizmo's Guide to Mental Health for younger and elementary students, and then it's real teens and mental health. And we also do Talk Saves Lives, which I like to call Dirty 101, into like signs, symptoms, ways to reach out for support, how to have conversations. But it also goes into mood, behavior, and talk, and being able to recognize it. So we are available, so please reach out to one of us, or you can shoot out your email in here. We can always contact you. But we do I think we're doing some of them virtually, but Talk Saves Lives, we've done them virtually as well or in person. But we've also implemented some of these programs at schools. It's Real Teens and Mental Health at a high school up north. And it was great to be able to give that information and have that within the school system for the kids to be able to know what if they see something in their friend that they're worried about, being okay and talking about it. And even in my sessions that I have teenagers, if they bring up something, I tell them that I'd rather have a friend be upset and mad at me than not take action. Or even as a therapist, we'll talk about it, when you come back or even while you're in the hospital. But my biggest thing is to ensure your safety and processing through everything afterwards, but always having that conversation with them. And so we are definitely available for those. And I think there was another question about gender roles and addressing them and navigating them, especially from a male perspective. And how would you address that working with somebody? For example, and if a significant other is either financially more stable or paying the bills or more of the household responsibilities, or just in general, if there's like differences that are going on, how can you address that with men that feel either emasculated, or if they don't, but kind of being okay with that or processing through that?
It's interesting when you bring that up. I think the very fact that we still use the term gender roles is a problem that we struggle through with, because we do have those typically masculine, feminine attributes that we put on each other, and breaking that wall down and saying, no, you're not helping out with the kids, you're parenting. You're not babysitting. That's one that comes up frequently with dads. But breaking down that idea that there are roles that are gender specific, I think is really important.
And I think the question at the end of it was, are gender roles real? And oh my God, I cannot speak anymore, but are the lines blurred and does it matter? And I think it depends case by case, but also I think times are changing in that part where there's a lot of equality, but also shared responsibilities in that. But then you're also going to find those that go by those typical, exactly what you said, Phil, in terms of those typical stereotypical norms of what a man should do, what a woman should do. But have you encountered any of those kind of issues or barriers, Logan, in your work?
Yes, a lot. The part of being the funky guy in town, being the guy to like hard-headed men too, who are like barely willing to go to therapy, is I talk about fairness a lot and reframe what's happening with how folks are getting stuck with saying, oh, I'm not supposed to do that, I'm a man, or I'm not supposed to, he shouldn't be doing that, he's like, well, what's fair for y'all? How much time do you have? What is the layout of the second shift look like? Where are y'all getting in where you're fitting in? Like, how are you creating emotional safety if you want to be a good protector? Making sure that we're having a full range of human experiences that we're referring to, and being able to name the parts with a gender specific affiliation, if that's how they're coming to it. Hey, dogs. And then being able to redirect it into what makes sense for the fairness, or what needs to happen at the basic levels of respect for the people who are in the room. So I mean, the roles are absolutely real. I mean, we're socialized with them, we're socially policed into them, and sometimes even bullied into them as adults. Do we get to make the choices of what we do in our own lives as adults too? Oh, heck yeah. And do they need to stick to those traditional roles to mean certain things for who we are as human beings? Heck no. Oh, I can't hear you. There you go.
I'm so sorry. I think you would know I wouldn't know how to use it. I'm so sorry about my dogs. I like trying to mute everything at the same time. So I apologize, but thank you so much for sharing that and addressing how real those conversations are and having to normalize it. We've talked a lot about normalizing. I know we're going over a little bit, but there's one other question that I would like to end with in terms of a participant that asked about who works in I work in an academic support services within an athletic department at a university, and asking and accepting help for academic requires a person to be pretty vulnerable in itself. I definitely agree with that. And thinking about the BIPOC community in college within the athletic setting, how do you think our society is doing to support this population, and what needs to be done to break down those barriers?
I would assume they suck at it. I would assume they suck, right? Because of the historical legacy of the universities and institutions with BIPOC athletes is awful. So I would assume it's got to be awful. I'm also a white kid who hasn't been played college sports. I don't know.
I've got I got 100% agree with you, Logan. Especially based on the things that we see in the news lately. It's, every other week something's coming out, and it is a systemic issue. It is something that we need these guys, because now we're talking about the real stereotypical gender, males, the college athletes, and there are predators out there who take advantage of that very fact, but letting them know that, they are just as vulnerable to emotional and physical abuse as anyone else, and letting them know that it's okay to talk about it.
Yes, definitely agree. And I think we still have a long road ahead of us in terms of getting to that part. But I do feel like some conversations are happening, but the biggest barrier is getting into the schools, getting into universities to have these conversations and to normalize it. But even athletes talking about their mental health issues can be huge, and there are some that have that, especially with younger males that are going through struggles and challenges, and seeing somebody that they look up to addressing, yes, I struggle with mental health and this is what I'm doing, could go so much further in terms of normalizing it too. But also, right, like we have difficulties getting into school systems or even into universities, and we are working on it, always trying to be able to provide those education services and reaching out. But I do see where you're coming from as well. And we're getting there, but we still have a lot of work to do. But on behalf of AFSP Illinois and our DEI committee, I want to say thank you to everybody that joined tonight. And for those that we did not answer your questions, we will get back to you via email. And any last things that you too would like to share while I pull up your guys' contact info to share.
Talking. Never be afraid to ask the questions that you're afraid to ask. You touched on it earlier, Dimple, and it's kind of like Seize the Awkward, the campaign that AFSP has going on right now. Is the only question that is wrong is the one that you don't ask.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree, and I think we're getting into a new age of needing to be able to look at how we are how we're getting stuck as a lack of integration of our humanity. Let's try to stay away from calling specific groups toxic or specific things. It's all about integration and empowerment. But let's be paying attention to the cycle of violence and making sure that we're not dehumanizing and objectifying people trying to talk about issues.
Absolutely. And also for those that cannot support, may not be able to, that have any financial barriers to seeking support, There's many different alternative routes that you can go towards, especially I went to DePaul University. I don't know if it's changed or not, but at least 20 sessions were $5. And I was able to go to therapy in secret because when I first wanted, I noticed that I was having symptoms of anxiety, but I didn't have the language, and I didn't even know that I was having a panic attack or the symptoms or anything. But I knew something wasn't right. And I secretly went to the counseling services, and I was able to do that without kind of my parents knowing, which eventually I did tell them. But at first I went in secret because I couldn't tell anybody. But also reach out to your school counselors. There's also other resources into community mental health services that are available. If you have any difficulties, please reach out. I'm more than happy to help find services if you guys are looking for. There might be a little bit of wait list. Currently, every place has that. So please don't feel afraid to reach out and look into university counseling centers if there are, and what kind of programs they provide too, because some provide unlimited free therapy as well. Some have a fee, but they can also guide you as well on obtaining services. And I'm going to send one more little resource for everybody that's out there. But you can find all of these resources or any other information on AFSP.org. And please do reach out and follow us on Instagram as well. We have a Facebook page. Our Instagram page is AFSP Illinois, and Facebook as well. All right. Thank you so much for all of you. I know we went over, but thank you so much from the bottom of our heart. And we will be back in next month or two, sooner, but with another panel. But thank you again for coming and participating. And if you have any other questions, we will address them as well. Thank you.